All right, so now we're going to move into our discussion of axiology and ethics, right? So this is a particular field under philosophy, axiology, so concerned with value, concerned with meaning. And as we move into this, right, we'll spend a bit of time with a different field of axiology, not ethics, but aesthetics, questions of beauty. And value and sort of taste and those sorts of things before we move into ethics, just to sort of give a sense of kind of how we might think of questions in other areas of value, right? But also as an analogy with ethics. And then as we move into ethics, I want us to think about kind of different ways we consider what we might call sort of normative questions. So the way things should be and how we ought to operate, right? So the types of kind of moral rules, right, that are given to us in the world, right? And is it just about sort of philosophical ethics, right? Or are there other spheres where this might show up? For example, in law or in religion, or culture itself, right? So what are the ways that this shows up for us? So that's where we're going to be headed. So I'm going to share the screen again, right? This is just a continuation of the same PowerPoint presentation as the last. So if you're referencing that, we're just moving forward. I don't know if it's shared. Just a second. Share screen. All right, there we go. So if we look at axiology, again, this field of value and of meaning, right? We have a number of other sort of areas in addition to ethics. Philosophy of art deals in the world of axiology, aesthetics, and philosophy of law. I mentioned before, that political philosophy deals with questions in axiology as well, right? So what we're thinking about here, right, is moving away from just the descriptive sort of areas, right? So metaphysics and epistemology and logic, right? They're dealing with kind of how things are in the world, right, or how we operate or whatever, right? They're descriptive. They're describing. They're telling us how things are. But when we move into this other way of thinking in ways that are incredibly important for human beings and our experience of the world, right, we begin to think about the ways we evaluate that world, right? So we evaluate the world according to not just kind of sort of quantitative data of how things sort of are, right? But kind of how those things in our experience give meaning and understanding to our lives, right? So you kind of experience things in different ways, right? Depending on it could be your mood, it could be sort of your cultural sort of background, right? It could be your upbringing. It could be something about human taste and concern about things, right? But these sort of add something sort of more, right? And it actually sort of explains the way we experience the world as such, right there. And so it's not like just like another layer, right? It's like we've got the descriptive, like, okay, here we have, sort of a human being. He was giving a lecture. There's a green chalkboard behind him and so on, right? And he's approximately this age, and these are the words that are being said at this volume and so forth, right? Like, it's not just that, like, there's that, and then like on top of that, right, like I have this feeling of like interest, or I have this feeling of being bored, or I have, whatever, right? But like you experience the moment as like, this is interesting, or the moment is like, this is really boring, or whatever, right? Like that's how the experience itself sort of comes to you directly, right? And all of that sort of comes under this sort of broader sort of notion of axiology. So we're going to look first at aesthetics, again, primarily as this sort of analogy with ethics, because I think it tells us something about how we think about morality, ethics, and so on. But also just to give us this sort of other taste. And so we're gonna start not by using the beauty as our sort of tool here, right? We're not going to be thinking about beauty. We're going to use a different sort of sort of marker, right? We're going to use cuteness, right? So I'm going to show you a couple of images, and I want you to think sort of, when you see the image, like, is that of an image of something cute, right? And I'll have two images, and I'll kind of describe maybe the experience that happens kind of in a regular classroom, right? Because you won't get kind of the feeling of it here, but I think there'll be enough to get a sense of what we're talking about and dealing with. So the first image is here, right? And if this was a live class in a classroom, right, I would ask people, right, do you find the image cute or of something cute? And see if people kind of raise their hands. And normally I will get pretty close to a consensus here, right, where people will say yes. It may not be a strong feeling, kind of depending on how you feel about cats or kittens or whatever, right? But usually I'll get some sort of kind of consensus, and I say, well, that's interesting, right? Like, why is that? Like, something that we take to be of taste, right? And if somebody says no, like, I don't think so, most of us would not say, okay, well, that person's wrong, right? In the same way, if I asked, is this a kitten, right? And somebody says yes or no, right? One's right, one's wrong, we might say. But when it comes to the question of like, is this image of something cute, right? We may say, like, I don't understand how you can't find this cute, or I can't understand how you do find this cute, or whatever. But we wouldn't say that they are wrong in the same way, but we still seem to get this kind of universal agreement. And if that one doesn't work, right, then I usually sort of pull this one up, and can usually get closer to universal agreement if I can't with the first one. And the question, like, I find interesting here is that if we're dealing with something that we sort of experience, highly subjectively, right? Like the sort of feeling of cuteness here, right, is something that's a kind of a subjective response that we might have, right? And we'll say things like, "ah," like we have these like these kind of phrases that express that, right? But it's not something that can be easily like argued, right? If somebody's like, no, I don't think so, and it's not like, well, come on, look at the eyes, like that will suddenly like trigger it, like, oh yes, of course, you're right, I was wrong, I now find the image cute, right? Versus like if somebody said that like this was not a puppy, you could give reasons like, well, yes, of course it is, like, look at this, look at that, right? You can give a description, and that, look, this image fits that that description or whatever, that definition of what a puppy is. So I think that there's something interesting that in a sort of an arena where we can't do kind of the purely descriptive type of thing, we still can have some sort of agreement. And does that indicate that there's a universality to cuteness, right? Or at least kind of on the sort of extremes, like maybe there's some areas where it's not quite so, where there would be less agreement, but if we sort of pulled up some specific examples, like, maybe we would get that sort of agreement about that, and what does that say? Is that sort of a description of sort of sort of upbringing and sort of culture and so on, right? That we've been taught that like, puppies are supposed to be cute or whatever, right? Or is it sort of is it pointing to some sort of sort of biological response that we have to sort of young animals, particularly ones that we have built a close relationship with as pets, right? And I don't have an answer for that, but I think that it at least clues us into a tension and a problem and a question we can have about ethics, because we also often, I think, experience ethical judgments in a similar kind of way, not the same way. I'm not saying that like it's the same way as sort of experiencing cuteness or even beauty, right? But we experience it often in an analogous kind of way, where it's a very subjective response of where like I feel like that is wrong, or like that was something courageous that person did, right? That we experience it that way, or that's unjust, right? Or that action is just, and we can certainly argue about those things, or give reasons. When I say argue here, I mean give reasons, right, to support our claim. But those are often sort of grounded in something that we assume that people are sort of on board with and are agreeing with, that they experience in a highly subjective sort of way. Subjective in the experience. When I'm saying this, right, like we experience it subjectively, right? But is it subjective? Or does saying that it's subjective mean that it can't also be widely shared and potentially universal, right? That's the question. Again, I'm not answering that question here, but I think it's worth thinking about, particularly when it comes to ethics, where it does matter, right, in our lives, whether or not people have some common understanding of moral values, right? We kind of expect others to abide in some way by those, and we could say, well, maybe that's sort of a legal sort of thing, but I think it goes beyond that, right? Like there are places where there is not a law on a particular point, where we still expect people to sort of act with a kind of courtesy or whatever, and so it's not. We don't kind of we kind of rely on a world in which these things are shared. Does that make it universal? Does that make it objective? Like I don't know that is the case, but we can ask the question at least. Okay, so that's dealing sort of aesthetics with this sort of idea of taste and using this idea of cuteness, right? Well, let's think a bit about ethics more properly and what ethics is. And I suggested that, like, when we think about normative systems, when I say normative, right? Start there, okay. Normative systems, right? It's any kind of system, any kind of sort of structure that tells us how we should or should not act, right? Or how we should behave, whatever, right? So ethics, of course, is going to be one of those. The law is another one of those, and there are certainly strong normative aspects to kind of social norms, right? And sort of cultural norms, right? And so we have kind of different layers of these sorts of things, right? And so, we'll talk about this when we get to law, right? But you can think about kind of certain behaviors and think about how these kind of interact with one another, sometimes come into conflict with one another. And again, this will come back up again when we get to law, but just thinking about speeding, right? And you may have an ethical reason for going a certain speed, right? It's dangerous if I go above a certain speed. It puts other people at risk. It causes certain sort danger on the road. It could be if I'm going through a place where there's sort of, pedestrians, or sort of around a school where there might be children that'll sort of go out or whatever, right? There might be a moral reason, right, that I go a certain speed because of the safety, right? There's the legal should, right? So there's a certain posted speed limit, and that posted speed limit, may or may not match, right, what is the sort of safe speed, right? Going above that may or may not be safe, and it could be higher, right, than what is considered to be safe, right? So it may not sort of match up, fully with the sort of notion of safety, and I'm sort of using safety as a stand-in for sort of the moral component, right? And then there's a sort of social part, right? If you sort of you go to a place where maybe there's a certain posted speed limit. Let's say it's 55 on a highway or a freeway, right? And people around you are going much faster. Like everybody is going, let's say, around you is going, let's say 65 miles an hour, right? And so there's this like social pressure, right, that's sort of going on, right, where it seems to not match the speed limit, and maybe the comfort you also feel, driving at. And so there's this kind of these different sort of kind of normative systems that are all sort of coming into play with something like a speed limit. So when I talk about normative systems, right, ethics is one of those, and of course, think about where other ones show up in your life. When you're in employment, right, or as a student, right, there's different places where these things show up. So let's think about what ethics is, and how it maybe is distinguishable from other areas where we find these kinds of values. And one way to do this, right, I'm not going to, obviously can't ask you to do this. If you want to do this in your journal or something like that, like that's a great idea. I recommend, doing that. But I use this in kind of the live form of my class, where I asked students, right, to say, hey, think of 3 moral rules that are important to you, right? What are some moral rules that you try to live by, or you think are important that other people live by, or whatever, right? And what do those look like? And these can be very specific sorts of things, like, don't lie, right? Don't cause unnecessary harm, right? Don't steal, right? Like very specific moral rules, right? That could be much more general, like, act with integrity, right? Act courageously. And kind of depending on how you kind of view ethics, view morality. I should pause for a second because I keep saying ethics, morality, and I use those largely interchangeably, right? One's coming from the Greek, ethics, right? Etymologically coming from the Greek. Morality is coming from the Latin, but in philosophy, right, these end up being used fairly interchangeably. And then why are the moral rules that you think of, right? Why are they important to you? What is it that you kind of in your life that has made these important? And then when you have these moral rules, right? Like, I want to be honest, right? Or not lie or whatever. Right? Is that something like I say about myself, right? Like it's the kind of person that I want to be or whatever, right? Or are these the types of things that we think other people should also live by? And I challenge you to think of at least one where you tend to believe, right, that other people should also live by this, right? This isn't just about like me, right, in my life, right? But I think that other people should also follow this, and if they don't, that they are likely doing something wrong, right? I'm not saying like judge other people's sort of behavior, right? But just think of those types of things where we kind of wish that other people right, would also kind of adhere to, right, for whatever reason, right? It might be because you think that it's objectively moral, right? It's an objectively sort of important sort of principle, or you may think that like, oh, well, society would operate better if we did these things, right? It can be different reasons, and then think about where the rules came from. Right? Why is it, right, that you pick these three things or whatever, right? Why is it that honesty, or why is it that, like, not stealing is so important, or why is it that acting with integrity is so important, or whatever they happen to be, right? What is it? Where do they show up in your life? Where did you kind of learn this stuff? Was it like just taught to you, right? Was it through certain experiences that you had? Right? What's the kind of source of that? And I think this is important early on, right? To be thinking about, okay, where's this stuff coming from, right? And are these the types of things that I can sort of consider and sort of question kind of their source at all, right? And thinking about source, right? In general, like, what is the source of our morality as human beings? This sort of idea, this question will be really important when we look at social contract theory, right? Where you have people like Hobbes who say, well, there's really nothing, right? We have no sort of morality at our source, right? We're all just after, doing whatever we can to, like, help ourselves out, right? We only care about, like, our own life, and we could care less about anyone else. Versus somebody like, Locke or Rousseau, who particularly Locke, who has a much more robust notion of human behavior, of sort of morality, sort of natural as part of human behavior, where we don't tend to just harm people. Certainly we have an ego, and that can cause harm, right? But we tend to get along, and so on, right? And so there can be a very different sort of view of human nature, right? And so some might say, like, well, it just comes from being human, right? It's the way we interact with one another. We're social beings, and so there's a basic sort of moral structure that's necessary for that, right? There could be kind of a religious sort of source to morality, right? And we'll look at kind of the sort of connections there when we look at law as well, and particularly with sort of the idea of natural law, right? It could be that it's a socially constructed sort of thing, right? That any society has a set of norms, and there might be overlaps between societies, but they're not all the same, right? Of course, those places of overlap might be interesting, right? If there's like a general overlap where all societies have kind of a set of things, what does that say? Maybe that's a structure for societies, right? Societies need certain things to be a society, right? They're kind of necessary, right? Or it might be something else, that kind of natural human norms are just sort of coming to the surface in that sort of set of social expectations. And then how do our morals, sort of our moral framework, how does it change over time? And I think there's two ways, right? There's one which particular sort of moral positions, right, might change, right? You might change your mind on something over time, right? But also, like, the depth might change, right? Certain things might still, kind of sort of you might consider to be right or wrong, right? But be much less important. And then other things might gain depth, right? Where you kind of maybe realize why this was important, or was maybe important, to your family or whatever, and you have had an experience or something where there's has become some sort of depth to that. And then the source, right, of our morality, that can also change over time. And, just not necessarily the case where we eliminate kind of those early sources. Maybe that may happen, right? Sometimes, right? And sometimes it may not, right? But quite often they expand, right? Or different sort of areas of our life become more emphasized, right? Like, I mean, I think about, as many of you sort of kind of leaving home and sort of coming into a university environment, or going into a career, right? Like, that's going to alter and change kind of the source of influence, right? That's and sort of historically, right? Things change for everybody in a sense, right? So all of these things can sort of alter over time, right? Does that always change kind of the morals themselves, kind of here, right, or not? And I think in some cases it may, in some cases it may not, right? And another question relevant here, right, is what gives the rule, right, this moral rule or position or whatever, what gives it its moral authority? What makes it a moral requirement that I should act a certain way, right? Where does the power of the should come from, right? Right? What's the authority there? Because like where I learn morals, right, may be the source here of the authority, or right, it may be teaching me something about another authority, right? What's sort of reasonable, right? Or it could be that the authority, you know, is sort of religious in nature, right? Or maybe it's sort of the authority, I'm recognizing kind of the social grounding for that morality, right? And I'm taught kind of over in this sphere, right, to sort of live well in this life, right? You need to do these things. But the authority, the reason why I ought to, right, might be coming from somewhere else. And so what gives it the authority? And of course, there's an analogous problem in the philosophy of law, right, where it's like, okay, what gives the authority to the law, right? Is it just that like the sovereign, right, who has the power says you must do or not do this thing, right? Or is there an alternative sort of place, right? Something like, oh, well, we live in a commonwealth, right? There's a social contract or something else, right? That provides that authority, right? So again, continuing to ask questions, and I'm not, you know, giving you an answer here, right? Because this is exactly what we're going to be talking about, right? These are the questions that will be at issue throughout this course. Related question to all of these is there a universal morality, right? Does morality have any sort of universal sort of appeal? And I don't mean sociologically, like in the sense of like most people tend to agree, right, that like not stealing is good, right? Or to not kill is good or whatever, right? Like that's a sociological question, right? And it might give us a clue, right? But what I mean by universal here is, are there moral rules that are universally valid, right? That everybody ought to adhere to, right? Whether or not they do, right? And that's quite often sort of the arguments. You look at sort of arguments in politics, right? Quite often it's about like, oh, this ought to be recognized universally because it's a universal moral, right? Someone might believe like that something is a universal good, right? And trying to use that as a way of convincing, you know, others that you too should agree with this. And so that's the question, right? Is there a universal morality, right? Or is morality just something that's relative or you know, subjective? Now, I think, you know, for most of us, right, I think there's a tension here where we like say yes and no, right? Where I say, okay, like, you know, you've got your sort of kind of worldview, right? I've got mine, and like they may or may not agree, and that's okay, right? But also at the same time, I'm like, well, you know, these things are just wrong, right? Like, you ought to not do this thing because it's wrong. And I think for a lot of us, we kind of have both, right? I don't find that like it's common for people to sort of you know, be kind of all in on, you know, universal morality on everything, or all in on kind of relativism on everything, but that there's this sort of dynamic or tension between these two things, and we might sort of pick out certain things as being sort of central and core, right, and kind of leave the rest in kind of an agnostic, I'm not sure sort of space, but but I think again, here's sort of a question that will continue to be coming back to throughout the course. So here, right, this is what I said, right, the sociological question, right, but also the ethical question. Right? Do humans actually have a common and shared morality, right? That's one question, right? But should there be a common morality? Are there moral principles or ethical principles or values or anything, right, that are universally applicable? That's the ethical question. Even if they don't see it, even if they don't recognize it, right? Some interesting sort of problems or questions that we'll continue to face. So first of all, the moral community, right? Who's included, who's not included in the moral community, right? And so it's the sort of question here around, right, is the moral community, and what I mean by this is those who deserve my moral consideration, that when I sort of make a moral choice of doing something or not doing something, right? Who gets included in that, right? All human beings? Are there certain moral values that get extended beyond the human sphere to non-humans, right? Whether it be to animals or to the environment or whatever, right? Do all humans get kind of the same consideration all the time, right? Do I sort of owe more of a duty to certain individuals in my life, right, or to my community, right, or whatever, right? Does it sort of change? And sort of philosophical ethics is going to be pushing at least to the universality amongst human beings, right? But then, of course, we have this sort of question beyond that, right? Does it extend beyond sort of the human sphere? But certainly, right, there are other questions, sort of practical questions about how we treat various human beings, right? For example, like the way I treat my children, or any child, I should say, just sort of make it more universal, right? So any child is going to be different than the way I treat an adult, right? And I think we recognize others ways that we should treat children versus adults, right? And so the universality question and that moral community question is important here. Free will, right? We mentioned this before, right? The question of free will becomes kind of a condition for many anyway, for even the ethical sort of enterprise at all. And then finally, moral knowledge, right? So that our ability to know what is right and wrong. Mentioning children, right? So we sort of think about children developing their moral knowledge over time, right? And that they don't, children don't just sort of like show up on the scene like fully moral agents, and we don't expect that of them, right? And so kind of what's our sort of and what can we know when it comes to moral questions? Is that something that all humans have, right, or all rational sort of beings have, or what, right? Then this will be sort of central when we get to Kant, especially. This sort of question of moral knowledge. Okay. And then finally, before we get to our discussion of Socrates, which again, I'm going to sort of pause the video after this, so there'll be a third video for our discussion of Socrates, but is to think about kind of the relationship between ethics and something like religion and something like psychology. Right. So I've been sort of comparing it to law, but there's another comparison that can be made when we think about ethics in a different sort of way. So we think about ethics as how to live the good life, right? We begin to think about ethics in relationship to other sort of spheres that try to answer those questions too. So if you think about the good life, right? The good life, is often sort of a central concern for something like both religion, right? Sort of various practices and sort of engagement, and that religion sort of provides a sense of meaning that's related to living a good life and so on. And then psychology also is concerned significantly with the sort of notions of living the good life, right? Sort of our own sort of psychological well-being, our emotional well-being, and so on is, of course, an important question and issue for psychology, both as a scientific discipline in terms of studying what it is, right, as well as in the realm of therapy, right? Sort of individuals, patients and clients, right, sort of receiving psychotherapy, right? Well, that's to help someone live a better life, right? To sort of aid them overcome their sort of their suffering, right? And so philosophy, where's philosophy fit into all of that? And so this class is really going to focus on that as well, right? Of course, we're going to look at notions of moral rules and all that, especially when we look at Kant and Mill and others, right? But we're also going to look at ethics in this other way, right? Which is what are the sort of the habits and ways of living, right, that can lead more towards human flourishing, human happiness, right, whether individually or as a group collectively, right? And so philosophy sort of fits within this whole discussion, and can be compared, in this way, right? Not so much with something like law, right, but more with religious traditions and with psychology. And the person that really kind of developed this idea, not developed it, right, but in the modern sort of period has sort of like said, hey, like this is what philosophy is about, right? Is the French philosopher Pierre Hadot. So I just want to sort of point to him because he really sort of moves ethics, philosophy and ethics in this direction of thinking about how is it that it helps me live a good life, right? And so here's what he has to say in his work called Philosophy as a Way of Life. Socrates had no system to teach. Throughout his philosophy was a spiritual exercise, an invitation to a new way of life, active reflection, and living consciousness, right? So it's about sort of a transformation of the person to a new way of life, right? A way of a sort of rational, sort of engaged and reflective living. This sort of living consciousness and believing that would bring one to human flourishing and to happiness. So we'll turn after this, right? So this will be the end of this video, but we'll turn after this to Socrates. And I think the Apology is a really great place to kind of see Socrates trying to argue this point, right? Kind of what that looks like, right? This kind of like this way of living, this good life, right? Kind of what that looks like. So we'll turn to that, and hopefully Socrates will give us some clues into at least what he thinks that should be like. But as we can kind of continue, especially over the first couple of weeks in this class, right? We're going to be looking at different philosophers and schools of thought, right, that try to answer that question, right? That's like, what is human flourishing and how do we get it? Like, how do we get it? And we'll look, kind of ancient Greece. We'll look at some Eastern thought. We'll look at some kind of religious thought, and all of them will be trying to deal with this this particular question. So we'll kind of wrap this video up. And then we'll jump into Socrates in the next one. So thanks so much for listening.